Well, greetings. Welcome to week one, lecture one for spiritual formation, or what we're calling life management and personal renewal. And I call it spiritual formation because I think it's more consistent with the context of what we're going to be dealing with in this class. And I want to spend this first lecture kind of defining spiritual formation for us. I know you're going to get some great definitions in the book from Maddox and Leclerc. But I also want to add some of my own personal experience, but also kind of talk you through how I understand spiritual formation to work and how it moves through our lives. So in about 2005, I was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. This was a diagnosis that I fought for several years, and I didn't want to accept the truth of the diagnosis, because to do so in my mind would admit that I was in some way weak. I've always been a very driven individual. I still am a fairly driven individual. I have a tendency to see a hill and want to take it, to run hard, to run fast, to run long, and to wear myself out if need be. But when I was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, and I began to recognize that this was going to be a long journey for me, something had to begin to shift within me. And what I began to realize is that some of what I had been accustomed to just in my few years of experience as a Christian, and at this point I hadn't been a Christian very long, that the Protestant church, especially the Protestant evangelical church, is more prone to want to focus on experiences. And so I thought maybe if I had the right experience in dealing with my generalized anxiety disorder, that would cure me of it. So I would go to the altar, I would pray hard, I would have someone lay hands on me. And that whole process, though good and I feel like beneficial, and I would never want to diminish its importance in my life or in the life of anyone else, I began to realize it was insufficient to help me day to day with the kinds of struggles that I was now facing, in light of the vulnerability that I would stepped into personally in dealing with my generalized anxiety disorder, which I'll just refer to as GAD at this point. And so I began to have to navigate and think through, okay, what is this going to look like for me moving forward, and how do I navigate this well? How do I navigate this faithfully? And it sent me into a period of time where I began to really search out texts and practices of the church throughout the course of the church's history that have sustained men and women, have shaped and formed them to live faithfully into the calling that God has for them. And that became a really important journey for me. So I picked up St. John of the Cross's Dark Night of the Soul, and I began to read through that and peer into what was being said there about how maybe I had become addicted to the experience of God rather than God in God's self. Then I began to read some of the early monks and some of the early nuns of the church, and find out what are the practices that were a part of how they administered life within monasteries and convents that help shape and form the people under their leadership. And I began to realize that, unfortunately, what the evangelical church had done is it had missed an incredible wealth of opportunity and material that had been present throughout centuries, that would, I think, play a significant role in helping people lean into their faith and their futures as followers of Jesus. And so I began to peer into these spiritually formative practices, and I began to take them up. I began to read as often as I could and as many as I could. I began to read the contemplative thinkers of the church. I began to employ certain practices in my life that I felt were absolutely necessary along the journey. And so spiritual formation has become a big part of who I am, and I think it's been a big part of what has sustained me in my ministry. But not only what has sustained me, but when those pieces are absent, it's the point at which I find probably myself the most vulnerable and maybe the most susceptible to the temptations of pride or the flesh or whatever that is that's a part of my life. But spiritual formation, the practices of spiritual formation, the regularity and consistency of spiritual formation, I think have played a huge role in sustaining me as a leader. Which points me to just a couple things that I want to note in this particular talk, because we talk about spiritual formation. What exactly are we talking about? And I want to talk about, it's a process that doesn't minimize the importance of certain experiences. And I want to say that because we do have epic experiences with God. And I think many of us can point to moments in which God became so real and rich for us. But But too often I find evangelical Christians, especially, sort of bumping from experience to experience. And we begin to long for the experience and not the God of the experience itself. And I think what spiritual formation does is it helps to maybe to afford us the resources on a deliberate, intentional, daily, weekly, monthly, yearly process that helps to continue to shape and form us and make us who we are called and created to be. So I want to say that it emphasizes process over experience, but it doesn't want to minimize the moments and the importances of those experiences as they arise. And I want to tell you this, that as I've navigated spiritually formative practices, I've had experiences arise from those practices that have been inflection points in my journey, where I've been able to point back to and say, okay, because of this practice, I've seen a move in the right direction. And so I want to say it prioritizes practice over experience, but it doesn't want to minimize the importance of the experience itself. The second thing that I would say is that it really does sort of, I think, emphasize practices over knowledge, right? So as evangelical Protestants, we have a tendency to say, if I can just know more and think better, then I can do better. And I think what spiritual formation recognizes is that we are not just cognitive, right? We are full-bodied human beings. And I tend to believe that we sort of practice ourselves into transformation rather than just think ourselves into transformation. And I think that's also extremely important when it comes to spiritual formation. What are the practices that we are involved in our lives that they in themselves have the good of being formative, habitual, and transformative over the long haul? And maybe they don't come with the goosebumps every time that you do them, but as you participate in these practices, you are being formed and shaped and made into some form of person. So let me give you an example. Every time I preach, I mark myself with the cross. That's the only time that I do it, and I do this because in the ancient church, the marking of the cross was assigned to the devil, that I have come under the lordship of Jesus. Now, when I mark myself right before I preach with the cross, there's no goosebumps, there's no feeling, there's nothing associated with it. But it is something deliberate that is named within my own spirit, that as I preach not under my own life, my own anointing, or under the power and presence of the enemy in the world, but I am coming under the authority of the one who is Jesus Christ, right? And so I want to recognize that, so that practice has become important for me to be formative in even how I understand the preaching moment. And so practice is over just knowledge. Now, knowledge is going to come with it. You're going to read people, you're going to experience information, but I want to say it's the practices itself. And so we're going to talk deliberately throughout this journey that we're going to take over the next 8 weeks about the formative practices that are so necessary for the church. And in fact, this first book that we're reading by Leclerc and Maddox and all of the chapters associated with it are going to give us some of those practices. Then I want to say that spiritual formation is the peace in which our soul begins to find rest in God. That this anxiety-ridden, we're going to talk about this over the next few lectures as well, this sort of anxiety-ridden nature of what it means to pastor in the West is I think brought under the Sabbath rest of God's grace when we are engaging in those spiritually formative practices. I think spiritual formation is where our lives are aligned to the purposes and the grace of Jesus. That too often, and I talk about it with my friends all the time, that our lives are like vehicles moving down the road, and if our tires are just misaligned, we're going to find ourselves leading towards a ditch. And I think spiritual formation, when taken seriously, is a means by which we are realigned and we are brought towards the center. So for me, even the practices of the Christian calendar, which we'll talk about throughout this course, is a way that yearly I realign my life to the gospel of Jesus Christ, and I move in that direction in a meaningful way. I think it's where the voice of God can be heard because we've given space for discernment. I think that's huge when we talk about spiritual formation. When we learn to quiet our souls, when we find a bit of silence and solitude, we're able to then put ourselves in a place where we can really get a sense of the voice and the heartbeat of God, and that we can come in alignment with that God is moving and at work in this world, and that through spiritual formation, I can find myself sort of joining God in what God is up to in the world, rather than trying to sort of carve out carve out my own place in this world. And I think spiritual formation is also where we are refreshed day by day. We can be left weary and wounded from ministry. And I'm going to talk about in the next lecture this idea of bitterness and burnout, which I think are two plagues that can really impact us as ministers of the gospel. And I think spiritual formation is the means by which we are refreshed. When we get to bathe and bask in our belovedness, then I think we are moving in the right direction towards a formative means of finding ourselves present with the one who brings healing to our souls. And then the last thing I would say is that spiritual formation is the means by which we experience the sufficiency of grace that becomes our strength and resilience for a long and enduring road ahead. And that if we take these processes and these pieces seriously, that God can renew, refresh, and help us to find strength for the journey. So that's just a little introduction of spiritual formation that we're going to talk about. In this next lecture, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about bitterness and burnout, and then we're going to talk about the legacy of the celebrity of pastor and what that has caused for us as ministers of the gospel. And then we're going to talk about longevity and leadership. And so this week is going to serve as our introduction to what God is leading us towards throughout this course.